privilege of meeting the Prime Minister. The issue is here, which has been unveiled earlier this morning. The Prime Minister spoke extremely eloquently about how he feels this is a great opportunity for India to sort of drive the new world order, sort of be a pivot and ensure that you play a critical role in shaping the new world order. Could you elaborate on some of those aspects where you think this presidency will leave an indelible mark?
So, Saurav, let me first compliment on you on this issue of business today. It's an outstanding issue, very outstanding content, excellent content. And I think you should ensure that everybody reads this issue of business today to understand what G20 is all about. Secondly, if you look at the transformation, there are a couple of trends which are taking place in the world. It's important to understand the paradigm shift that is taking place. One is when G20 started in 2008, the developed world was contributing over about 75% of the global GDP. The developing countries were contributing only about 24-25%. If you look at it now, the share of the developed world has come down very radically. It's about 55%. The share of the developing countries has increased very substantially. So the share of the developing countries is going up, the share of developing countries is coming down. What is happening is, as the IMF has rightly said, this year 80% of the global growth is going to come from the global South countries. The global South is going to contribute to 80% of the growth. And in the next 2 decades, two-third, and it's quite incredible, two-thirds of the growth is going to come from global South. And this is going to happen because the demographics are in favor of global South. This young population, the population in the western part of the world is aging. And if growth is going to come, all the growth is going to come from global South, then you need greater flow of financial resources for the global South. Unfortunately, the international financial architecture and the multilateral financing institutions which are created post-World War II are not designed for many of these issues. The second trend that is taking place is that there is a movement away from the big tech digitally to models which are open source, open API, interoperable model which allow for greater innovation and allow for private-public play, which India has demonstrated through identity, banking, fast payments, etc. And the third key trend that is taking place is that there is a massive, because of climate action, there's a massive transition taking place in terms of just an inclusive energy transition. So India is at the forefront of all these 3 transitions. We are driving young demographics, we are driving global growth, we are driving digital infrastructure through digital public infrastructure, and we are driving renewable energy, and we are driving green hydrogen, which will replace fossil fuel. So today we import 200 billion worth of fossil fuel. Our aim is to become an exporter of clean energy by 2047. And these 3 trends will really redefine the world of tomorrow.
Mr. Kant, which are the key takeaways you think? I mean, India, of course, is driving these important items of the agenda, like you just mentioned. It so happens that these are areas where already India is at the forefront. So India is like a great shining example, particularly in areas like DPI, where people are really marveling at the kind of progress India has made. What do you think as we approach the end of the year and the end of the presidency? What do you think are the key areas where you think India will be able to sort of give key takeaways? And what are your expectations as the presidency sort of is handed over at the end of the year?
So a couple of issues. One is that throughout the presidency, India has been the voice of the global South. The Prime Minister, when he launched the G20 presidency, the first thing he did was to have a meeting with 125 heads of state to understand what they wanted during India's presidency, and those became our key priorities for G20. So first and foremost was that if the world is, 1/3 of the world is facing recession, then you need to drive strong, sustainable, inclusive global growth, which is very important. The second is that if you look at sustainable development goals, and we are at the midway point of 2030, only 12 of the 169 SDGs are on track. The post-COVID era has actually led to regression in sustainable development goals. So education, health, nutrition are very critical for the world, and accelerating the pace of implementation of SDG is very important. The third is climate action and climate finance. But both climate action and climate finance and SDG require long-term financing for developing countries. And therefore, we've said that our fourth priority will be the reform, redesign, and the restructuring of the multilateral development institutions for the 21st century. And therefore, working on this with all the countries to redesign and reformulate them is a critical task, and allow greater flow of resources from billions to trillions is a very, very important component of our presidency. And therefore, it's important that these institutions get redesigned. And fifthly, the fact that you need technological transformation, you need digital public infrastructure like we've done. During COVID, we were able to provide resources to 800 million people, cashless, paperless, into their bank accounts. And today, over 650 schemes of the government, we put money and resources into their accounts. And the fact that we do almost 46% of the digital fast payments in the world. We do 11x more than Europe and America. We do 4x more than China. Digital payments, everybody does it on the mobile, using QR codes now. So that, if you look at the world, 4 billion people do not have an identity. 3 billion people do not have a bank account. 133 countries do not have a fast payment mechanism. So you need to take the model of DPI of India to the rest of the world, especially the global south. That's important. So we needed an acceptance of digital public infrastructure. You needed an acceptance of the framework for digital public infrastructure, because there's no global definition. The world does not recognize DPI at the moment. So we are going to do that during our presidency. And lastly, as the Prime Minister said very clearly, that our presidency must drive women-led development, women empowerment, gender equality, because 50% of the world will be women. And without them, you can't drive growth. So you need to have better learning outcomes, health outcomes, better nutritional standards for them. And that is what we are driving at. But clearly, the focus is on the global south. We've shifted the voice away from the developed world to the developing world. We've demonstrated that G20 will be the voice of the global south.
That's absolutely right, Mr. Kant. Just before this session, the World Economic Forum President Borge Brande was here. He mentioned something very interesting, that he sees over the next maybe 10 years or so, G3 emerging, where India will be one of the three with US and China. What are your thoughts? Do you think, in a sense, this G20 presidency has sort of laid the foundation for India to be really, really at the center stage of world global growth and prosperity and drive that agenda?
So we are now the 5th largest economy in the world. We were the 10th in 2014. We've come to the 5th. We will definitely attempt, as the Prime Minister said, to be the 3rd largest economy by 2027 end. But our objective has to be to grow at high rates to be a $10 trillion economy by 2030. And that's critical. And I quite agree with Borge that this is really the India's decade. And we've carried out all the structural reforms. We have young demographics in our favor. We are firing on several cylinders, from services to manufacturing to agricultural productivity to urbanization. All these are key trends, and therefore digital public infrastructure will enable us to leapfrog. Now you need the states to be, Indian states to be the key champions of India's growth story. So if India grows at 8% plus for 3 decades or more, I think we'll definitely be the key players in the world. I think this is truly India's decade. This is the rise of India's decade for various reasons, and we must demonstrate our will that the reforms that have been carried out, the structural changes that have been made, must be implemented by the states as well to enable India to emerge as one of the big key players. But this is truly India's decade.
Mr. Kant, yesterday you were at the B20. I heard you speak very eloquently about many of these points. I also heard you say something very interesting about growth with free trade. As countries become a little more inward looking and all of that, how do you think that, do you think that will be one of the key challenges the G20 will have to work on collectively and ensure that that really takes place?
So, Saurav, we've done an analysis of previous pandemics, and if you look at previous pandemics which have taken place in the world, after every pandemic, you've had a story of protectionism for the next 5 to 6 years. Every country starts doing protectionism, and you're seeing this in several, you see this in the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS Act in America, you see this happening in China, the big economies. But it's important that to understand that actually, free trade has lifted very vast segments of population above the poverty line. Every time India has grown, it's grown on the back of exports. Whenever we do well in exports, India grows. So exports are very critical for India's growth story. I've been a long-term believer that exports will be the key to our growth story in the future. And therefore, India must become a very major exporting nation. This would require size and scale of manufacturing. That's what we've attempted through the production-linked incentive scheme. And my belief is that free trade is very, very important for India to be a key player in the global economy in the years to come. We need to drive manufacturing to penetrate global markets. We must be a key exporter and penetrate global markets, particularly the American and the European markets.
Where this B20 this year is also particularly important is that it stresses under India's leadership also the role of the private sector in many of the areas. For instance, in climate change, in the whole funding part of climate change, in SDGs, in pushing the SDG agenda. Where do you think, how do you see the reaction? You've been speaking to a lot of the global, top global corporations which have come to Delhi. How do you think the whole global corporate world is reacting to these things?
So it's not, the first priority, as I said, is strong, sustainable, inclusive, balanced growth for the world. Because the world is in recession right now. It's not possible to grow without the private sector. Private sector has to be the driver. The corporates have to drive growth. The government can be a facilitator, can be a catalyst in ensuring that private sector grows. And that's why India's B20 presidency was very important. And India's B20 presidency has been done very well. The task force reports have been absolutely brilliant. They've produced some excellent results. They worked in partnership with the private sector, and they will really help to drive the growth story of India. That's very, very important. And therefore, we are truly believers that the private sector will be the key to the global growth story. And we strongly believe, like many other countries do, that we lay emphasis on private sector really driving production and productivity in the world. Essentially, that's important. The global value chains are important. Demonopolizing these global value chains from one country to several countries is important. In the long run, it's the private sector which drives growth, and India's G20 presidency has assisted and supported B20 in a very big way. This is probably the best B20 ever held.
Do you think there was this proposal which was put forward as, I think, one of the task force recommendations of a 0.2% contribution by the corporates globally to sustainable goals and to climate change? Do you see that actually happening? We've done it in India, like it was told, that we've done the 2% sort of contribution of profits in the CSR space. Do you see that happening at a global level?
So, Saurav, it's a very interesting question. And it's important to understand that actually 1% of the corporates account for 40% of greenhouse gas emission in the world. 1%. The challenge is that we don't have machine-readable data. We are not able to put that data in front of the public to say that these are the 40%, these are the companies which are contributing to 40% of the greenhouse gas emission. Nobody is clear about that. And then we do not have a Moody's like we rate countries You are rating countries, but you don't rate corporates on the basis of their greenhouse gas emission. So what you need is that the corporates, the stock exchanges across the world must have one interoperable framework. We must have machine-readable data saying that these are corporates polluting, and we must penalize them, and we must say there will be a credit rating to them on the basis of their greenhouse gas emission, and markets will penalize them. That's the most important thing in the world to my mind today. But more important is that at least these companies which contribute to 40% of the greenhouse gas emission, not 0.2%, but I think 1%, they must contribute to climate action and SDGs. But that's a process in evolution. That's a very good thought idea which has come in from B20. We'll try and discuss with the G20 and try and take it forward.
So that's something you'll definitely pursue at the
G20. Of course.
Meeting.
All fascinating ideas, all interesting ideas are there to be pursued.
This is a very, very interesting one of getting the large corporates, global corporates to contribute, he says 1% of their profits to climate action because they are the top 40%, 40 companies are the biggest polluting. Mr. Kant, I'll come back to the other big issue of the reform of multilateral development banks. Now that's again a challenge. There is a big report which has already been put out. The second report where Mr. Singh, N.K. Singh is one of the co-chairs, is also expected. What are the expectations you have that this will actually again go to fruition? Because that, as you rightly said, is critical to the, the taking forward of the SDG goals, financing of the global south in that sense, bringing in more funds for the global south. How do you see that taking place?
So there are several components to this. The first report has been brought out, and the finance ministers, the finance track, the FMCBG as it is called, the finance bank and the central bank governors have sent it back, noted it and sent it back to the boards of the respective financial institutions to have a look to see what more funding they can do within their existing equity base, within their capital framework, capital adequacy framework. What more lending can they do without because for them, maintaining their credit rating is also important. Yes. So what more lending can they do within that? And that's quite a bit can be done. And that's for the individual banks to see. The second bit is that how are you able to use your balance sheet, or if not your balance sheet, many other balance sheets, to be able to do more of private sector lending. There's no shortage of money in the world.
That's right.
I mean, there's 350 trillion. The world needs 6 to 7 trillions. But there is 350 trillion available in the world. 150 trillion is available with sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. How do you make that money move to the global south? Because the risks here are more. So the balance sheets, if they can be used to do more of indirect lending, that is, blended finance, that is, to my mind, credit, how do you credit enhance? How do you do first loss guarantees? There are various ways to provide more lending. So that needs to be done. That is, we are going to do no more direct lending, we are going to do indirect lending, and on the back of what we lend, we'll do 15x more lending. That's the key, to my mind, and that is where these institutions need to move towards. Thirdly, I think to the international financial architecture, what is happening is that resources are moving from developing countries to the developed world. It could be vice versa. Inflation in the developed part of the world leads to higher interest rates, and then it moves. Yeah, so there's the financial architecture needs to be restructured.
The other area, Mr. Kant, where India has actually shown the way, and again, this particular G20 presidency is sort of setting the stage, is on startups. Now, this is the first time the startup infrastructure has come into the center stage, and there has been an entire Startup 20 which has been set up. Tell us a little more about what you expect as the outcomes from that.
So it started from the fact that we've been able to establish the third best ecosystem in the startup movement in the world in a very short period. Yes. And we have over about 110,000 startups now. We have over 110 unicorns. And therefore, we thought that if technological innovation and technological developments have to take place, then you need to put the startups together. So we've had a very lively, very vibrant startup movement for the first time, which was done during our presidency. We've had all the countries vigorously participate in it. And I think a lot of young people participated in this because we showed that actually these are startups, many of them are national assets because they've used the digital identity to do paperless, cashless credit. Several of them have done paperless, cashless wealth creation. Young startup like Zerodha controls about 29% of the stock market, gone to tier 2, tier 3 and cities. And then you have number of young startups like GoDigit and Acco, which are doing insurance on the mobile, on the go. So what you're seeing is identity, banking, wealth creation, fast payment, insurance, all happening through innovation on the mobile. And the cost of acquisition of a customer has fallen rapidly. It's important that, if you look at the world, 133 countries do not even have a fast payment mechanism. So you need to take this model there so that you can provide liquidity to the people without any leakages. And that is really the model for the world, that you have fast payments for them. That will require digital identity. That will require bank accounts. And that will require fast payments. And this is a unique model of India which can be taken to the rest of the world.
Mr. Kant, you are the G20 Sherpa. Now, we will have the Leaders Summit coming up in early September. Typically, that is, of course, a broader agenda. There's a bigger platform. How much of the B20 takeaways do you realistically see being discussed and agreed upon at this year's G20 Leaders Summit?
So a lot of B20 recommendations, these communiques, are being examined. In many ways, they will find a very distinct component in the as we go forward in our discussions. Because without the private sector, you can't have global growth. If 1/3 of the world is suffering from a crisis of slowdown, and we must understand Germany has gone into recession now.
That's right.
1/3 of the world is in recession. 75 countries of the world are in global debt crisis. So if you want to solve that without private sector, you can't solve it. So private sector has to play a very key, critical, and a very major role in this.
The Prime Minister, in fact, now that you mentioned the debt crisis also, in our interview, he's spoken about the whole debt restructuring piece. Where do you see that heading and the role India is playing on that?
So, there are several countries impacted by the global debt crisis. This issue has been discussed extensively in the finance track. So you've seen the Sri Lanka solution, you've seen Zambia, Chad, Ethiopia, many other countries finding a solution to this because of the various initiatives that India has taken. That's a burning priority of the global, of the finance track, actually.
And what India, of course, has done some of these things which we just discussed. How much of it do you see as the presidency eventually changes hands? How much do you see is the issue of continuity, which I want to raise here? How much do you see actually taking place beyond? Now, India can do this much within its presidency. How much of influence do you think India can wield carrying forward these wonderful, new initiatives which we have done into the next year and for subsequent years?
So, Saurav, for the first time in G20, you have 4 developing countries, one after another, holding the G20 presidency.
Yes.
Unfortunately, Indonesia was hit by the Ukraine war in very, very big way. So it wasn't, I'd honestly be saying that they did their best. But ambition was lacking because of the COVID and because of this. But during India's presidency, right from the word go, we've put Ukraine on the back burner. And we've said that the ambitions of the developing countries and the global south must be in the forefront. So we've brought the agenda of the global south, the developing countries, and we said that growth is taking place in these countries. And therefore, we put this agenda of development in the forefront and put every other issue at the back front. And therefore, my view is that that should be the strategy of Brazil, that should be the strategy of South Africa, that they should continue to bring the global south and the developing countries right in the forefront. Because without that, you will not be able to uplift people. If you want a human-centric approach to growth, you can't do that without the developing countries driving, because they are really young demographics. Can you believe it? 6 of the fastest growing countries in the world are today in Africa. 6 of the top 12. So that means growth is going to come from India, it's going to come from Africa. And therefore, you need long-term financing to drive this growth. Without this, you will not be able to lift the humanity. Without this, you can't have global growth.
Which is what the Prime Minister told us also, if you do not include the African nations, how can you talk about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that development for everybody?
So this is the first time that the Prime Minister wrote to all the leaders that African Union must become a permanent member of G20. That was a bold move. And that means that you're providing inclusion to G20. And that means that you'll actually be giving a voice to 55 countries of Africa during the G20. And that's a very big move. And that is being discussed and debated, and most leaders across the world have very favorably reacted to it.
By when do you see that actually happening?
During the Leaders' Summit.
So that because the Prime Minister also spoke very hopefully about that.
No, we are very, very optimistic about this. Prime Minister's voice has had a big resonance across the world.
Do you think that that could be one of the biggest takeaways and the legacy India will leave after this G20 presidency, the inclusion of the African Union?
Yeah, that'll be one of the big, but let me tell you that India will leave behind a lot of legacies in terms of development. Huge legacies. We are not talking about the content right now, because most of that gets discussed in the last meeting. But all our ministerials have been very content-driven. We've been very ambitious as far as the content is concerned. They'll be discussed in the final Sherpa meeting and finally approved by the leaders. So you'll have to wait till the Leaders' Summit. But our presidency will be very content-rich. It'll be very ambitious, very bold, very aggressive, and very ambitious.
Do you expect a clear statement at the end of the
Yeah. I'm very hopeful that on all development issues, we'll have a consensus.
And finally, Mr. Kant, you have been sort of at the center of driving so many of these initiatives. What has been going on in your mind? You've done so many other, you've performed so many other roles earlier. You've been pivotal in Niti Aayog, and now this is a global stage, really. What do you think, what drives you? What has been this whole driving factor over the last 1 year?
Well, just remain focused and sleep well. That's all, and do lots and lots of exercise.
Yesterday you said you sleep very well.
I sleep very well.
And you don't really allow these concerns, global concerns to really eat into your sleep time.
No, not at all. Not at all. Don't get unnecessarily worried.
Be calm and
remain focused. Remain focused.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kant. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and many, many good wishes to you for the future.
Thanks. Great pleasure.
Thank you, sirs, for that lovely session. Mr. Kant, I'd like to request you to stay back on stage. And I'd like to call upon Mr. Dinesh Bhatia, our Group CEO at the India Today Group, to felicitate Mr. Kant on stage. So, on charting that path to becoming, well, a major power in the year 2047, we want to talk about several sectors that will be disrupted. We've spoken so much about technology.